Alright, guys. Let's get started. I'm actually just going to do my screen today because it's been a long day and, yeah, I have some giant zits on my face. Super fun, right? And it's pretty late at night. So, um, I am not wearing makeup. So, alright. So, today we're talking about the Cold War conflict. So we're actually looking at when there was actually fighting during the Cold War, um, which will get pretty interesting. So we have three essential questions today. So the first one is, what common factor triggered the hot wars in Asia during the Cold War? How did nuclear weapons influence political relationships during the Cold War? And in what way did the domino theory affect U.S. policy during the Cold War? So to start us off, George Kennan and containment. So George Kennan, he was an American, and the year's 1947, and he was like really pushing for containment in for like communism. So let me try and explain this better. So he wanted to try and stop Soviet expansion of like communism. He didn't want communism to grow any further, and he didn't want the Soviet Union to grow any further. Um, so he went around and gave like lots of lectures about it and wrote histories about the relationships between the USSR and the United States. And he was a diplomat. That was his job. And he was like one of the big pushers. So a lot of Americans, right, they started to believe in this idea of containment, right, to try and stop the spread of communism. And that started in the later 40s. So keep that in mind as we're going through. Today we're also going to be talking about proxy wars. So a proxy war has competing powers supporting different sides. To do something in proxy is to like do something for someone else, like instead of someone else, right? You're like subbing in almost. So you have these competing powers, and in this case the superpowers. So we have like the USSR, aka the Soviet Union, versus the United States, but they're not going to just like straight up declare war on each other. Instead, they're going to use other countries and kind of back up these countries that are having like civil wars. So proxy wars typically settled only when it suits the interests of the external powers that are involved. So even though it might be a civil war, and it's like, okay, well, when the people who live in that country, when their problems are resolved, well, guess what? The war's not resolved for them. It's resolved when the bigger countries backing them up resolve it. So examples of proxy wars would be the Spanish Civil War, the Greek Civil War, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. So US versus USSR using proxy war, right? So during the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union each wanted to make their political and economic systems dominant, right? So the Soviet Union wanted communism to be the dominant system. In the US, we wanted capitalism and democracy to be the dominant systems. Right, these two countries, they're going to engage in proxy wars. Specifically, we're going to see the Korean War and the Vietnam War as the proxy wars. And each will support opposite sides with matching political orientation. Okay, so let's take a look at the Korean War. Here's a little bit of background information. So, because Japan had controlled Korea since 1910, Korea did not have its own government at the end of World War II. Um, Claims to power were divided into two main groups: committed Marxists who had fought the Japanese as part of Chinese guerrilla armies, and members of a Korean national movement. The United States and Soviet Union agreed to divide the country at the 38th parallel for administrative purposes. When the two sides could not agree on a formula for unified Korea, President Truman persuaded the United Nations to assume responsibility for the country. Military forces in North and South increased. However, resistance by communist supporters in the South slowed the growth and training of its army. In early 1949, North Korean leader Kim Il-sung asked Soviet leader Joseph Stalin for permission to launch a conventional invasion of the South. In early 1950, Stalin approved an invasion. So here's a map. Oh, did I not? No, but that one's right. Just kidding. So the 38th parallel is a line of latitude. So here we can see some of the things that were going on in 1950. So the red is the North Korean offensive, and the blue is the UN, the United Nations offensive. If you actually notice, they cover most of Korea. And so, right, they draw the line in the middle. This one is mostly 1951 and 1953. Right where the fighting is. So right after World War II, Soviet Union, United States split up Korea into two. As U.S.-Soviet relations grew more tense and worse, we'll see two separate governments pop up in Korea. So the side that the Soviets had taken over, the north side, will have a more communist government, and in the south you'll have an anti-communist government. War will break out in 1950, when, with the approval of Joseph Stalin, the communist government in North Korea invaded South Korea. Fearing further communist expansion, right, that George Kennan, right, fear of expansion, right, and that wanting to contain the Soviet Union. So fearing further communist expansion, the United States sent troops to help repel their invaders. The Chinese sent troops to reinforce the North. The war continued until 1953, with neither side a victor, and with Korea divided at the 38th parallel, just as it had been at the war's outset. So the war pretty much ended how it started, right? No one gained any more land or anything like that. And right, you guys know that this is still kind of a big deal today, right? All the stuff we hear about North Korea and South Korea, I mean, this is still kind of a big deal. So I want to look at essential question number 1. So what common factor triggered the hot wars in Asia during the Cold War? So when we look at a term like the Cold War, right, so it's cold because it's mostly like a ideological war, right? It's a war of thoughts, of feelings, right? A war of words, not weapons. So a Cold War is where there's not a lot of like physical actual fighting. And so in response to that, a hot war would be like the Korean War, where there were weapons and, you know, guns and all that kind of stuff. So that's what we're kind of looking at there. So think about, okay, factors that triggered the Korean War. So one factor would be the differences in political ideologies, right? Communist versus anti-communist. When the Soviet Union and the United States split up Korea after World War II. You could say like where the border was drawn, that's a factor, and so on. We're going to switch gears a little bit and look to North America with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this is happening during John F. Kennedy's presidency. We're going to look at a couple things with it. So this is a quote, and this says, "One of the major failings of the Bay of Pigs operation was Americans thought the popular uprisings in the wake of the exile invasion would lead to the overthrow of Castro." Right, so totalitarian regime in Cuba. So in 1959, a socialist revolutionary named Fidel Castro overthrew Cuban dictator, oh man, I should have looked up how to say his name beforehand. Fulgencio Batista? Question mark? Instead of a totalitarian regime. The United States considered the communist regime in Cuba, supported by the Soviet Union and close to the U.S. mainland, a threat to national security. So basically, the United States is like, whoa, Cuba's communist, they're totalitarian, the Soviet Union's BFFs with them, and they're super close to our country, so that's a threat. So in response, the United States comes up with this plan. The United States takes a bunch of exiled Cubans who didn't like Castro, and they take these exiled Cubans and they organize a military assault at the Bay of Pigs in southern Cuba. The CIA trained all these exiled Cubans, and the invasion was a total disaster. Not a great spot on American history. Bay of Pigs has nothing to do with pigs. It's the name of the bay. It's on the southern coast of Cuba, and in 1961, right, that's when those Cuban exiles, who were trained and supported by the CIA, attempted an invasion to overthrow the communist government in Cuba. The invasion failed, and a lot of them were killed. It was a massacre. Soviet missiles in Cuba. So 1962, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev ordered the placement of nuclear missiles in Cuba in an attempt to counteract the threat posed by U.S. nuclear weapons in Turkey. So the United States had weapons in Turkey pointed at Russia, and that's like super close to Russia. And so then Khrushchev's like, you know what, Cuba, you're super close to the U.S., let's do the same thing to them. So what the U.S. does is in response, they blockade Cuba to prevent Soviet ships carrying missiles from reaching Cuba, right? So they surround it, make it so they can't get in. And that causes a lot of tension. There's actually a movie. I actually watched it in one of my high school classes. I think it was U.S. history, but it's titled 13 Days. It's PG-13. It's really intense, and they filmed it in black and white, which is kind of crazy too. But anyway, so you have like these really, really intense days where it's like probably like some of the most intense days of the whole Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Khrushchev ends up agreeing to turn back the fleet of all their boats, their warships, and remove Soviet missile launchers from Cuba if the United States removed its missiles from Turkey and pledged not to invade Cuba. President Kennedy agreed and was like, whoa guys, that was a really close one. We almost all blew up. So the two countries also set up a hotline between Moscow and Washington to facilitate communication so that they could like call each other and talk and stop things before they got too crazy. So number 2, how did nuclear weapons influence political relationships during the Cold War? I mean, they're pretty key, pretty central to it, right? I mean, it's the United States having the weapons in Turkey really put a strain on our relationship with the USSR, and then them having missiles in Cuba really stressed us out, and so, right, it's a big deal. All right, Vietnam War. So, domino theory. So the United States government was afraid. They feared that other Asian countries would fall like dominoes to communism if communists succeeded in taking over South Vietnam. So they're like, South Vietnam's the key. If South Vietnam falls, then all these other countries are going to fall to communism. This domino theory had a strong influence on U.S. foreign policy in the 1950s and 1960s, and is what ultimately led us to join the fight in Vietnam. Domino theory was popularized by President Eisenhower in 1954 in arguing for U.S. involvement in Vietnam. This is a quote. Finally, you have border considerations that might follow what you would call the falling domino principle. You have a row of dominoes set up. You knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is the certainty that it will go over very quickly. So you could have a beginning of a disintegration that would have the most profound influences. But basically what that's saying is they were afraid that if Vietnam fell to communism, that all the other countries, right, in the area would fall to communism. 1954, Vietnam was divided into two parts. The North under control of the communists, the South under non-communists. And they would remain divided until the end of the Vietnam War. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson sent troops to Vietnam to prevent the communist regime in the North from invading and gaining control of the non-communist South Vietnam. A couple really important things with this is this was an executive action. It's like a policing action. The United States didn't actually declare war on Vietnam. We just sent troops to help South Vietnam. So we were never at war with North Vietnam. And that's an important thing because Congress never declared war, the Vietnam War was not by law allowed to be censored. And for the first time ever, the majority of American households had TVs. So all of a sudden we'll start to see lots of news reporters and news sources like going and filming war. And for the first time, people are seeing what war is like from, the comfort of their own homes. And they're not happy. And that's part of the reason why we see so many anti-Vietnam War protests during this point in time is because, all the news sources are able to put out anything they want. Because in the United States, if we've declared war, the government does hold some power to be able to censor, like, what information gets out. So, but that wasn't the case with this, right? It's not censored at all. So, in the additional resources for today, I added a CBS news clip. That kind of, it's really good at showing kind of what these news reports would have been like, showing like the people and how they felt. During the course of conflict, neither side made significant gains in the Vietnam War. In 1973, President Richard Nixon reached an agreement with North Vietnam and withdrew U.S. troops. Within 2 years, the communists controlled all of Vietnam. Cool. Your assignment today, so if you're watching this video, it's like, heads up, So those three essential questions are the questions for your assignment. And they're just in essay form. So make sure you go back through your notes and essentially write down what you would put, pop on this quiz, type in those three answers, and that's it. You're done. So make sure you did the warm up. Make sure you do the three essential questions and put them in that homework. And then, right, I'm adding more and more stuff about the Korean War and the Vietnam War. This is the YouTube link to that news report from March of 1970. It's really interesting. I would recommend watching like the first minute or two of it. And I hope you guys have a great day. And I'll talk to you later.